y'all. Welcome to Kansas City Business Cast. So we have a very special episode today. Before I get into it and introduce my guest, I wanted to kind of highlight something that I've been talking about. I've been screaming this on this podcast ever since I started. And if you know anything about me, you know that I practice what I preach when it comes to this about being vocal and supporting people in the space, in the podcast space in general, and not only the businesses and the business owners that I have on this show, but, the local podcasters, the local creatives, the local influencers. But if people have a, sort of presence on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube, it is so important that you subscribe to their channels. It's so important that you leave reviews or ratings. Those platforms have that function. And two areas where we really need some help right now so that we can get KCBC back into the top of the search results. This makes a huge difference, just so you know. The level of impressions that we log, the level of views, listens, all of that is we need 5-star ratings on Spotify. We also need 5-star ratings on Apple and written reviews on Apple. And anybody with an iPhone has an Apple ID. And with that, you can actually leave a written review. Okay. So I figured I'd start off all these new episodes with a little bit more than, please subscribe, share, like, and comment and all that stuff. Those are two areas that will cost you nothing and will help us a great deal, tremendous deal. All right. Now that I got the spam out of the way, very excited. Amazing guest today. There is no other. She is my number one, and she was also number one, episode number one on this podcast. I got Stephanie Reisinger here from Hopeful and Whole Counseling and Motherhood in America podcast.
Woohoo!
Welcome to the show,
Hi.
Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I don't have any notes. They're all kind of stored up in here. And you and I have been talking about this for months, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give everybody kind of a little history lesson, if you don't know my wife, Stephanie, or if you didn't listen to episode 1, but Stephanie has well over 16 years of experience in the mental health, behavioral health, counseling space. We've been talking about this. It's been in our conversations whenever we talk about, this podcast, KCBC TV, which we're both rocking our shirts today. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And kind of getting you back on the map as far as podcasts go. We know this
Mm-hmm.
isn't your first time, starting up a podcast, but what I find so interesting, babe, is that when you started the Holistic Fertility and Wellness podcast, we were going through infertility. And we talked about that on episode 1, but I just thought that was so bold and courageous of you to do that. And I was the first person that said, hey, respectfully, how do you think people will take it, knowing that we don't have kids yet? And, your response was something to the effect of, hey, I'm going to do this on faith. We're just going to lean into it. And that whole experience was amazing because you racked up tens of thousands of downloads. You talked to people all over the world and you learned so much. And that is one of the reasons why I push podcasting so much to people of being this like growth accelerator, because not only are the listeners learning, but the podcast host is learning as well, especially if you have that type of format.
Yeah, for sure.
So, we talked a lot. We covered a lot of ground in that first episode, but what are you most excited about to talk about today? And what did I miss in the introduction?
Sure. Well, just to do maybe just a brief recap of what I do, what I have done. I've been in mental health for over 16 years now as a marriage and family therapist, and but I've worked in lots of different spaces. And just over the last about 5 years, actually, I guess it's a little more now, I've been specializing in perinatal mental health. So that is pregnancy, postpartum, infertility, loss, all the things connected to those things. And so I've had a podcast in the past. I had the Holistic Fertility and Wellness podcast that I hosted 2016 through about 2018, maybe. Because I sort of trickled off toward the end. I had a few episodes here and there. I've also had a private practice for quite a while, and I'm a director of student counseling now at a local university while I'm running my private practice. And so I have obviously some personal experience as well as a lot of professional experience when it comes to the things that I do professionally. and where we're going to be going from here.
Great recap there. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I love how you highlighted too that you've continued with Hopeful and Whole counseling, because I think it's really important to note that, most of the time what happens when we go back into full-time roles, or for you, huge step up, huge opportunity to just take what you've learned and then also get into a space where you can learn so much more being in a university sort of environment.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes people assume that the business kind of dies, but what's
Right.
been amazing is that you've been able to keep on some of your clients, and so you're still on that journey with them. And I know it's unfortunate because I don't think you were able to keep your entire group of clients, but it's important to note that you are still building your personal brand. You're
Mm-hmm.
also helping people with the deep work that you started with them in Hopeful and Whole counseling, and that's so important. So obviously, this new podcast, Motherhood in America, tell us about that. What's the name all about? Why Motherhood? Tell us a little bit about the genesis of how you got to that name.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Well, we had, like you said, we've been talking about me relaunching a podcast for a while now. And for the last several months, we have talked about it as Hopeful and Whole, the Hopeful and Whole podcast. And I knew mostly what I wanted to talk about, but I couldn't exactly get excited about it. And having it called Hopeful and Whole also just felt unclear. I've really appreciated and enjoyed that name. But when it came to this podcast, it just wasn't connecting for me. And then just very recently, I was thinking about actually how a lot of millennials are choosing not to have kids. This was something that was coming to mind for me. A lot of millennials are choosing not to have kids. And I've heard a lot of the reasons for that. And at the same time was wondering, is there something that we're doing to sort of misrepresent motherhood to others that is causing them to think it's this horrible thing that they want to avoid? There are definitely challenges in America that we face that are unique American challenges, and at the same time I'm wondering if the positives, like, we're missing out on also sharing the positives. So what came to mind for me is like, how can I communicate a more balanced view of motherhood? And of course, in America, because this is where I live, this is where I'm a mother, this is what I understand the most. And when it comes to research, this is the research I know is what's happening in America. And so it just clicked. Like, it just clicked for me. Motherhood in America. I looked at a couple of other names to see if they were available that were similar names, and they were not. And this is the one I landed on, and I love it. I'm very pleased.
I get the chills, babe. I seriously get the chills hearing you talk about it, and got the salt truck driving by. we're on the precipice of snowmageddon here in Kansas,
Right.
so or snowpocalypse, whatever they want to call it. But I've been thinking about this one. It's not a gotcha, but like, how are you gonna separate Motherhood in America from every other momcast? And trust me, I'm not calling yours just another momcast. I don't believe that. But there are so many women that have podcasts and have opinions. And when you talked about what are we doing to misrepresent motherhood, there are some people that, you could easily, put in that category of maybe they're misrepresenting it, or maybe they're representing it in a way that is good for their audience, but then communicates something else, right?
Mm.
So, what's different about Motherhood in America, or what's going to be different about like the new episodes and the guests that you're going to be having on?
I am going to be speaking honestly about motherhood in America without bashing America. I think that's one big piece of it, is that I think that what I hear a lot of actually is a lot of just part of the let's share more about the reality of motherhood has also become complaining about motherhood. and complaining about the situations in which we find ourselves in America. And I want to talk about those situations. I want to talk about those challenges without it being a bashing session on how terrible America is. Because I don't think that. I don't believe that. We have challenges, and I want to be a part of implementing some solutions, a part of having discussions that help to make those improvements, because I love America, not because I think it's terrible. And another key component, I think, too, is that I am a Christian, and that is 100% the guiding force in my life is following Jesus. And so that, of course, is going to come into play and come into conversations about how the kind of perspective that I want to have about these things. So I think just those things combined, I just really intense interest in culture and social interaction, social norms, the way that society changes over time. Like, these are things that have always interested me. And so I think that, combined with my faith and maybe the connections, the people that I know, the spaces I've had the opportunity to work in, being able to bridge sort of conversations between people who maybe have differing views. I want to be able to do all of those things, and hopefully in a way that is gracious and leaves room for discussion rather than a lot of negativity.
Yeah. So, when you talk about have people on with differing views, like I get so excited about that because of how level-headed you are and how you truly are an amazing listener. And duh, I'm biased, right? But it is something that, you and I, we've grown up together. We're high school
Hmm.
sweethearts. So everybody knows, like, I've known Stephanie for more than half of my life now. Like,
Like, way
we've
more
been
than half.
celebrating, yeah, like we've been celebrating birthdays together since we were 17 years old. And one of the things that I just love about you, Stephanie, is that people like always come out of conversations with you saying, gosh, she's such a good listener. And you chose being a marriage and family therapist because I think one of your God-given strengths is listening to people. And so when we're talking about people with other viewpoints and people quote on the other side, which I know even you don't like that type of binary equation. Like, why does everything have to be you're either for or against? For any of our listeners who maybe they're not Christians, or maybe they're of another faith, and maybe I hate to use the overused word, but maybe they're a little triggered by saying she's going to bring her Christian views into
Mm,
this. How
yeah.
is that going to be different as well? Because that's something too, like some people just turn off. And when they hear that, right? And
Hmm.
we know, like, every podcaster has their target audience, but there's also part of this Motherhood in America movement where you want to talk to mothers in America regardless of their faith, right? So
Yeah.
anyway, to kind of reel back what I originally asked, what would you say to folks who maybe they heard that and they're still listening? Oh, well, okay, you're going to bring your faith. Well, they're probably building mental archetypes, or they
Mhm.
could, of popular Christian influencers, podcasters, like personalities, celebrities, even like certain networks, right? Then it goes down into political beliefs. And then all of a sudden they've just totally put you into this bucket that they think you belong in just
Sure.
because you said this one thing. So what would you say
Right.
to
Yeah,
those
I know
folks?
exactly what you're talking about. That, like, because I'm a Christian, this is probably going to be like a right-wing podcast, that everybody knows what my beliefs are going to be. They've got it all lined up. Like, yeah, there are people who are make those kinds of assumptions. And I guess what I'd say to that is that I'm a human. I'm an individual, and so I have my own individual thoughts and interpretations of things. And I don't think a lot of it just neatly lines up in the box that others might put it into. And so I hope that even if somebody doesn't share my faith, that they'll give the podcast a chance. And I think if you were to ask a lot of my sort of colleagues in this space here in Kansas City who know my beliefs, and also they have different beliefs, and we have worked together really well. I think that they would say that I am maybe open-minded is the right word, or that I can exist in spaces where people have different beliefs than me and actually just have conversations without imposing my beliefs upon others. Now, I do plan to speak openly about what I believe and how that impacts my perspective on these issues, but it's not meant to be prescriptive to others, to try and tell others how they should live their lives, but that this is how I see it, essentially. But even saying all that, I'm not only talking about faith in these podcast episodes either. There's a lot more that comes into it.
Absolutely. Without giving too much away, right? Because you're going to be, we literally talked at the table today about some of the guests and prospects that you're going to be talking to about having on this show. You also announced in the reel that was dropped on Instagram last week about some things that you're going to be talking about. And you mentioned a couple things like breastfeeding, racial disparity. Can you tell us about some of the things that you're going to be talking about, and maybe give us a window into some questions or perspective points that you're going to make on those topics in unpacking those?
Yeah. Let's see if I can sort of conceptualize some of that. I was thinking actually a lot about it today, about the breastfeeding episode. I already have my guest lined up, and she is enthusiastic about participating. And she is so smart, and I think will be such a great person to chat with about this. And she is also a Christian. And one of the things I was thinking about within that topic is how taboo breastfeeding still is in this day and age. It's very strange that
Why?
that is the case. And I think that part of it is it's sort of this perspective shift of like, a lot of what the discussion has been is that it has been taboo because people have over sexualized breasts, for example. But then I was thinking even more about this. I think more of what the problem is that we don't want mothers to be sexual beings. There's this very like strange sort of hurdle that people have to jump over to imagine that one can be a mother and also sexual, because we are. Like that's what got us to motherhood, many of us. And so it's this very just like weird cultural dynamic that we have, and talking about that in the context of even of being a Christian, of how do we sort of reconcile this idea of being modest while also honoring the fact that our babies need to eat, like whenever and wherever we might be, is that I think that we as a culture could stand to get over that hurdle, recognizing that this is how God designed our bodies, that God designed our bodies for this function, designed breasts for this function. And so I don't see anywhere in the Bible that says that He designed us in this way, and also we should cover up or go hide when we're feeding our children.
Because that's the controversy, right? Is like
Right.
one of many
One of them.
micro
Yeah.
controversies is no one wants to see that in public. What are you doing?
Right.
Covered up, woman's covered up, baby's nowhere in sight.
Babies all hot and bothered with a blanket over their faces, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Yeah, or like
So,
go to the bathrooms. People say things like that. And like, do you
right,
want to eat in the bathroom?
right. Yeah. And then what other topics do you plan to kind of address in the first few like video episodes?
Yeah, I do want to talk about racial disparity in maternal health, and that's a huge problem. It is at crisis levels in America at this time. And so I would like to just share some facts. Actually, the person that I want to interview for that, who I have not spoken with yet, but hopefully she will say yes. The person I want to interview for that will probably have more facts to share than I have. But I want to just share some statistics to start out with so that the general public or whoever is listening to this has some understanding of just how serious this problem is. For example, the maternal mortality rate for Black mothers is so significant. And then when it comes to mental health, average woman in America who has a baby, 1 in 5 of those women will experience a perinatal mental health disorder. Well, that's the average of all women, regardless of race. But if we separate that out into racial boundaries, then we find that Black mothers actually experience perinatal mental health disorders at a rate of 1 in 2. So we're going from 20%
50%.
as the average, yes, to 50% as the average for a Black mom. And that is a serious, significant problem. And we need to be discussing more, I think, in our society about why that's happening, about how we can prevent that from happening, how we can better support Black moms, and how we can recognize what may be contributing factors, not contribute to those factors, but be part of the solution. And so that's a huge topic that is really on my heart quite a bit.
When I interviewed Clarissa Evans, who is one of your peers
Mm-hmm.
in the maternal mental health space, and then also in the Kansas Birth Equity Network, which you are
Yeah.
actively involved in, and that's one of the points that makes you also qualified to speak on it, and then also have subject matter experts, because this is your tribe. Like you're
Yeah.
talking to people about this, and you're getting into the hard work with them. This information, it's out there, but I look forward to Motherhood in America being a sort of mechanism or a vehicle for getting more awareness out there. This journey for you, like, again, this is your second podcast journey. What did you learn the first time around? We didn't get into this in episode 1 too far, but what lessons are you going to apply from your first journey of podcasting into this next sort of iteration or season of podcasting?
Yeah, I learned in my first experience with podcasting just how much I learn doing this, how much I learn talking with other people and interviewing other people. I also learned that I actually know some things, which feels so silly to say. But when I first got into podcasting, my thought was like, I'm going to ask other people, all these experts, I'm going to ask them a bunch of things and get their wisdom. And then I also realized, wow, I have actual contributions to make as well. I know some things from personal experience, from professional experience. I have things to add to this conversation. And so I think I'm going into this podcast with more confidence in the contributions that I have to make to this conversation.
Absolutely. And we've talked about that too, just so everybody knows. KCBC TV is the sponsoring network for this initiative. And our team is going to be helping Stephanie with some of the editing and just making the reels and all of that stuff. So we're going to be handling some of that so that you, Stephanie, can focus on just the art of talking to these folks. And something that people can expect is not only these guest interviews, but you're also going to be doing solo sort of talks. And, if they go to the Motherhood in America podcast, that's MHIA.podcast on YouTube, they'll see that there's an educational piece that you put out there. There's a video version and an audio version. Tell us about some of your experience in education, and what you've been up to in the last year, because I think you've done some
Mm.
pretty exciting things as far as teaching.
Thanks for asking about that. So, I had 5 years of adjunct experience, an adjunct professor at a university in California when we were out there. And since we've been here until recently, I had not been teaching in the university, but had actually created some training programs for local perinatal providers. So that could be pelvic floor physical therapists or lactation consultants, chiropractors, pediatricians. I mean, so many doulas, birth doulas, that was another one, midwives, about understanding perinatal mental health. And so I wanted to help give them a framework for some of the ins and outs of perinatal mental health in a way that was geared toward them, the stuff that they need to know. And then there's a bunch of stuff they don't need to know that often is in these training programs. So this was geared specifically toward their needs, and then how they could also recognize when they might need to make a referral and how to make a referral. And so once I started doing that, it was such a cool experience. I had such a great time doing that. And then that also actually got the ball rolling for me to get into providing continuing education courses for mental health providers. And so I've presented 3 now continuing education courses for mental health providers in perinatal mental health, the foundations of perinatal mental health. And that's been super fun.
So everybody knows, like any sort of licensure, especially in the medical behavioral health fields, continuing education units are abbreviated CEUs. So like registered nurses need them. I think physicians need them.
Mm-hmm.
Social workers need them. And so, the fact that you have provided that opportunity for them to get some credits, but also learn about something that they might not come into contact with all the time. Or
No.
maybe they've got a growing number of clients are talking about these things that they don't feel equipped to do. And I feel like that opens up another sort of element of what you do. Can you talk about the level of resources that are, and then the sort of gap that's not being met in perinatal mental health?
Yes, there has been a lot of growth in perinatal mental health over the last several years. That has been wonderful, that there have been more people getting the certifications, there have been more training programs developed, and we still have a really long way to go. Most graduate programs for counseling, marriage and family therapy, social work, most graduate programs do not contain any significant information about perinatal mental health, which, if you really think about it, is just wild. It's just bananas. Because if anybody is going to go into the mental health field and work with clients who at any time may get pregnant, may have a baby, or whoever have in the past, which is a lot of people, then you need to have some familiarity with this. I do not think every mental health provider needs to specialize. That's not necessary, but needs to have some familiarity. And I continue to come across quite a few mental health providers who didn't even know that what I do existed. They didn't know that perinatal mental health was a specialty. And so the fact that so many providers still don't know that. And that means that there are still a lot of mothers who are being treated for these disorders, for these challenges, by somebody who's not familiar with how to treat them. And that's concerning. And that's where I'm wanting to continue to be part of spreading more awareness and providing more education. And I'm even just so grateful that I am given now the opportunity in an upcoming university course that I'm going to be teaching for graduate students in counseling, where I'm going to be given an opportunity to teach them about perinatal mental health as part of that course.
Yeah, that age old Gandhi quote about being the change that you want to see in the world. I do remember like it was yesterday when you were saying you couldn't believe the lack of resources
Mm-hmm.
out there. This was years ago, right? And that there has been progress. It's been amazing. But the fact that I think God has given you the vision for how to fix or cross that gap,
Mm-hmm.
that has been foundational in so many of our conversations. How you have been so focused on what is the solution, though? What's the solution? Because we can bitch about this stuff all day long. Like we can complain and bash and whine, but if there's this idea, we've talked about this in our marriage, but like if I'm aware of the problem, I'm aware of that problem for a reason, and maybe it's up to me. Not all the time, not all the time is it going to be up to me to solve that problem,
Mm-hmm.
but if it's something that I am perceiving at this time, how many of my gifts or my sort of desires or my interests align with possibly solving that? And if it's not a whole lot, who do I know that, might be able to help with this? And so I love how you've had actually kind of both. It's weird. I'm realizing and articulating this for the first time. You've had the skill set to approach this problem and solve it meaningfully. And in doing that, you've found your people. Like, you've found your tribe. And I imagine if you ask some of these folks, some of these women that you've been connected with, and there are some men in this space that support as well, they would say too, like, I'm so glad I met Stephanie. Like, Stephanie's part of my tribe, you know. And I've seen how you've created and others have created networks for you to step into, and you're creating a space for others to step into. You know, when it comes to motherhood and what you've learned, we have our kids, and we went through the pandemic together. We've gone through a lot of challenges in raising our kids, and full transparency with everybody listening, we had a family prayer before we sat down to do this interview, because I do believe in spiritual warfare, and I feel there is an enemy, and there are forces that don't want this conversation to happen, just straight up. To go back to, you know, being a mother and
Mhm.
what you've learned in our time, what are some things that you've learned going from infertility into being a mother, and then now deciding, like, I'm going to create a space in the podcast for other topics about motherhood to come up?
Question. So many things,
Sure.
so
Where do you
much,
want to
which
go
is
with it? Yeah.
part of why I'm doing this podcast even is to share about so many things that I've learned and continue to learn all the time. It's, gosh, I mean, I could go so many places. One of the most important things I think I've learned is managing my expectations. So, one of the challenges of going from infertility to motherhood was that my expectation was that once I had a child, I would be just happy and blissful, and that it would not be easy. I didn't have the perspective that it would be easy, but I think I had this idea, because I had wanted to be a mom for so long, that I would feel just totally fulfilled by it, that it would be, I'd be really good at it. And I just was proved very wrong about a lot of things. It was my first year of motherhood was very, very difficult. And I went through postpartum depression and anxiety, and my world was just turned upside down. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I had to relearn how to be a person. um, a lot of that was, I mean, there are a lot of factors that play into that, but a big piece of it, I think, was my expectations of myself, of what I thought I would or should be capable of, what I thought the experience of motherhood would be like. And again, there's so many factors that even come into play in creating those expectations. Some of it was expectations I'd put on myself. Another part of it was expectations I think that exist societally, that that one should only be happy. I think I received those expectations from others, that knowing that we went through infertility for so long and loss, that now sort of reach the goal and should just be so happy and excited. And I wasn't, and I really judged myself for it. You So yeah, those expectations are huge and continue to be something that I have to adjust. Just like you're talking about, before we sat down, all of the challenges that we face just trying to get this stuff set up and have this conversation while the kids are home. Like, we have to be constantly adjusting our expectations. They are also humans stuck in the house because it's cold and sleeting outside, and we're also asking them to, be quiet for a little while we have this conversation. And it's like, we have to constantly manage our expectations as parents of ourselves, of our children, of society. It's a big, important piece. One of the most important lessons I've learned.
Absolutely. You know, when you're thinking about the podcast and this early journey, who do you think it's going to be important to reach? And I don't want to just stick it to just mothers, right? I mean, you
Hmm.
started by talking about the name, because of the perception that motherhood has, and because of, younger women maybe being turned off by it. But who do you hope to reach in this next year?
That's a really good question, and maybe something that I even just need to think more about who my target audience is. I think millennials in general are probably my target audience, considering that age range, I think at this point is, we'll say between like 30 and 45 or something.
Right. Right.
People who are kind of either in the thick of it as far as being adults, and many of us having kids and doing the whole parenting thing. But like you said, I hope that not only parents listen to it. I
Yep.
hope that others listen, people who are not parents listen to it as well, to get a better understanding of the experience of motherhood in America,
Absolutely.
to better understand their loved ones, to again be part of solutions, even if they don't have kids themselves. I'm sure they care about people who do have kids. And so yeah, I hope that it impacts a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. I really, as you were talking, I was thinking about it. And I was like, the first legacy episode that's out right now is with Leah Viss, and it's talking about miscarriage. And, miscarriage happens to 50% of
Yeah,
pregnancies, 50% of
right.
pregnancies. And people don't know what to say.
Hmm.
Um, if they want perspective, maybe they can listen to like that episode for an example. Men can listen to it as well. And that is something that, when we went through all of our loss and our journey, I also was like, there's no support group for dudes who really wanted to have that kid. And
Right.
now I don't get to have it either. And, going through counseling, and maybe the counselor knew what it was like to be a father going through infertility, thing, or a future father. But again, that's our perspective, right? It's like, I was a dad, I lost my baby, right? We've talked to you about how you're going to be talking to people who have grown children. You're going to be
Hmm.
talking to people who are, quote, empty nesters. There's going to be the whole spectrum's going to get covered on this show. And that's why
Yeah.
I love how broad the title is and how strong the title is: Motherhood in America. Boom. You know what I mean? What else do you want to make sure everybody knows about?
Maybe I'll just share some of the other ideas of things that I have to talk
Yeah,
about, because
absolutely.
then, and I have more than this, but I'm not going to remember it all off the top of my head. I have a list here of the ideas that I've written down, because
Right.
I
Yep. Go
want
ahead.
I want to remember and sort of get to these things. So one of the topics I do want to cover is why some millennials, or many millennials, are avoiding parenthood. I want to talk to some people who have made that choice not to have kids. I want to look at some of the research about the reasons that people give. And honestly, I don't want to rebut it. I don't want to take that approach to it, because I don't want to tell them that they're wrong. Like that's not the idea. But if there are misconceptions that people have that I'm finding, then I do want to talk about that. I do want to speak to those potential misconceptions, and kind of the way that society, I think, is currently presenting motherhood is just so sideways and weird. So there's that. There's breastfeeding, like I talked about.
Real quick, what are some of the sideways perspectives?
Yeah, there's a lot of either or. What's coming to mind for me right now is the move from the idea that mothers have to completely sacrifice themselves, to like this pendulum swinging over to, we have to prioritize ourselves and self-care and that whole thing. But I think there's a different way, actually. That's where I say it's being presented sideways. So,
Sure.
like, I want to talk about a completely, actually, a different perspective than that, and one I think is a bit more biblically sound, also,
Okay.
um, in that we do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to clearly communicate this concept quickly,
That's
but
okay.
we do sacrifice. I mean, it's part of the motherhood game. I grew a human in my body, which pulls, the stores from my minerals. I gave of my body for my children. There's no getting around the fact that that's true. There was a time period in which I needed to really give away my career in a lot of ways in order to be present with my children. And in some ways it is still sort of limiting. My kids are young and they need me, and none of those things are bad. It is hard, it is challenging at times, but it is also with pleasure that like uh, shouldn't I shouldn't it be a sacrifice, like to give another human life? Shouldn't that require some sacrifice? And I think about how there are animals and insects within the world who die after having their babies or laying their eggs or whatever. Like, it's part of the process. And so I want to talk about that from a different perspective, and actually the real value in what is being really discredited, I think, a lot of times, mothers who, spend time doing laundry and dishes and whatnot, when like, how beautiful is that to actually do those things for your family, like to provide clean dishes and healthy meals and clean clothes for these people that you love so deeply. And so there's just such a different way to think about this,
Absolutely.
that I am not, it's not in the way of a martyr. Like, I'm not a victim of this role. I am a willing participant, and this is part of what that means.
Well, yeah, and before you go to the other items on your list too, I just want to comment too that like you took that sacrifice, like building your practice from home. There were seasons too where you lost like clients,
Mm-hmm.
like almost all of them through third party services you were subscribed to, and you were for contract for a while. You went through so much, and you are now a director level position, and you're getting back into teaching like
Mm-hmm.
in another state with a giant gap in full-time employment. Oh, this is why I just keep going back to, you're a badass of the highest order. You always have been. And even in my darkest times of being feeling despair too, of like, when the pandemic happened, and like, we remember there was a time, and I'm sure you'll probably talk about it, when we were like trying to figure out breast milk and things. Like, there are
Mm.
so many struggles that I've watched us endure, and you endure in particular, and the seasons of loneliness, because
Mm.
there wasn't a person that you could talk to about some of this stuff.
Right.
Or again, like you were saying, like when you talk about like how you took on a lot of it because you felt like that's what you needed to do as a mom. But you know I don't know, I'm just so excited about that. So what else? Yeah, I appreciate you going deep into that one as well. I know I kind
Yeah.
of asked you to provide an example, but yeah, breastfeeding. um
That's okay. You don't have to
Sorry.
remember all my things.
Yeah, you have the list, right? You got a
Yeah.
list
Yeah.
for you.
So, yeah, one of those things is the sort of social pressure to be and do all things as a mom in America. And I think that's really perpetuated by social media. And so I
Yeah.
want to talk about kind of the overlap of those things. Making health and medical choices for our kids in America, that's a big deal and a big challenge. And it's one of those things where I'm so grateful that we have the choices that we do. And it is difficult. So there's that. There's miscarriage, like you had mentioned. I definitely want to dive into sort of the cultural challenges we have here in America when it comes to miscarriage. And what I mean when I say that is the lack of framework that we have for grieving parents who have experienced a miscarriage. People, like you said, don't know what to say. People don't really know how to support. And again, I have seen that improve over time. And there's still a long way to go, a lot missing. And so, sort of just talking about the experience of that, what it's like for others not to know how to support you when you're going through it. And then also, like, having grace for those people as well, because they care and they want to help and just don't know how to do it. Things like the pressure to entertain your kids, which
Man, we've
is,
been talking about that ad nauseum.
yeah, yeah. There's that, and obviously, a lot of what we're talking about here is not specifically focused on the children. I think that's a difference too. Is like, this is not a parenting podcast. This is about the
Mm.
motherhood experience.
Ha.
But in
Appreciate
part
you
of
clarifying
that,
that.
yeah, that is a big difference. But in part of that, of course, is talking about having to make challenging choices. And part of the stress and pressure that a lot of parents face right now, especially moms, is believing that they have to constantly entertain their children, constantly be providing them with educational opportunities, constantly be providing them with hands-on learning and growth opportunities. And there's so little allowance for kids to just be bored and be kids. And so, yeah, I want to chat. About that. Take the pressure off of moms a bit.
That should be a freaking series, and you should have me as a guest. I would love to be a guest speaker on boredom with children and how to handle that. Anyway, yeah.
I mean, as
You're
we
gonna
are
have some dads on
currently,
the show?
maybe, I don't know
Maybe,
yet.
if
I
it makes
mean,
sense.
I might
Yeah,
want, at some point, I probably will want a male perspective,
sure.
and maybe even to talk about the male perception of motherhood in America. I would be
That's very
curious.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think you hit all the ones that I was thinking about because I've had the unfair advantage of talking with you and brainstorming some of this stuff as well. Is it going to be focused on local or Midwest things?
Not at
It's
all.
America wide.
No, I want
It's
to
all
talk.
America,
I
right?
mean, yeah, just Americans in
Straight
general.
up.
And so, yes, I hope to talk to people. I mean, people who I've already sort of got on my radar to interview are from all over the country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, obviously, wishing you all the success. And, we know from the way the announcement was handled by some of our friends in our tribe and our peers, and, I'd name them all, but, I know I'll miss somebody, but it has been something that people are excited about. And we know that you're gonna bring all that grace and that perspective, and I think the curiosity that's needed as well, because so often, when we're looking at influence podcasts, and maybe this is partly the fault of the observer too. I don't know that any podcaster wants to communicate to their audience or to the world that they know it all. I just
Mm.
I just don't. Now that I've done it too, and I've done a podcast, and I know you can speak from deep personal experience as well, as like, we are not the experts. There is so much about this journey of doing podcasts and having these conversations, to where, like, if you look at like things like even that we recorded like a year ago or whatever, like, we're gonna change, we're gonna adapt, we're
Hmm.
gonna, figure things out in a new way. And I'm
Yeah.
sure if you polled probably 100% of podcasters and influencers, and you showed to them their cringiest video from however long ago, they could probably tell you what they wanted and what they hoped to get across in that message, and how it failed miserably and what they've learned. And so there's that journey too. There's that journey of learning. So
Yeah, I mean, yes, which is why I will be interviewing a lot of people. I will have some solo episodes, but definitely I'm going to interview a lot of people who know more about certain topics than I do and have a lot to also add to the conversation.
absolutely. So, what's the best way for people to get involved, and make sure they stay ready so that, when this content starts coming out, they're getting these updates?
Instagram is mhia.podcast. And I know motherhood is one word, but we had to do that MH because other things were not available. So mhia.podcast. And on Spotify and YouTube, Motherhood in America. Is Apple available yet? Are we still waiting on that?
No, I have to reach out to them. I may need to impersonate you when I do that, but we
Okay.
need to figure that out, because we've got the channel built and it has a link, but when we go to it, it's not available. But we will get
Okay.
Apple. All you Apple people out there, man, they're a large amount of the KCBC audience, Apple listeners. So we're gonna have to. We'll get it figured out, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So yeah, it'll soon be on Spotify, YouTube, and on Apple. Motherhood in America in all these places.
I love it. All right, Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the show. Obviously, proud to get the word out there, and anything we can do to support, we will.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, everybody. So you heard it from Stephanie. We're going to be getting these Motherhood in America episodes out. It's going to be amazing. Totally expect it to be a movement, and something that will grow over time. Again, ways that you can support KCBC KCBC TV is by following on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook. Definitely subscribe. Definitely hit those notification bells if you're finding value. Support your local podcasters. You know, us, all the other folks here that we have in Kansas City. We have some amazing people that are doing awesome work, and they are totally dedicated to this. We know because they're not getting paid to do it. And, this is a labor of love, and we love having these conversations. If you can help us by giving us those ratings and subscribing, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks so much.